The gates of Atarius opened like a wound. Cold iron groaned against cold stone, and the sound traveled across the courtyard, the way grief travels through a body, slowly, inevitably, reaching every corner before it finally settles in the chest. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the towers. It clung to the battlements like something reluctant to leave, like something that knew what was coming and could not bear to witness it clearly. The sky above was the color of ash, that pale gray that precedes light without welcoming it, and the banners of the Atarius kingdom hung limp in the still air, their golden threads dull, their embroidered griffins frozen mid-flight, as though even they had stopped breathing. Amelia Brokenwind walked through those gates with her spine straight and her hands clasped before her, and she did not look back. She wore red. It had not been a calculated choice, not a statement of defiance wrapped in silk and dye. She had simply reached for the only dress that felt like herself that morning, the deep crimson gown she had worn on the day she first arrived at the castle, the day she had looked out from the high tower and seen Zimbros riding the wind currents above the kingdom, golden and impossibly beautiful, and had felt for the first time that she had come home. She wore red the way a woman wears the memory of who she was before someone tried to unmake her. She wore it like a second skin, like a reminder. Her white hair fell loose around her shoulders. There had been a time, not so long ago, though it felt like another lifetime, when the women of the court had whispered about that hair. Too pale, they said. Too strange. Like winter, like snow, like something not entirely of this world. They had whispered it with their fans raised to hide their mouths, as though the words themselves were improper, and Amelia had heard every syllable with the quiet patience of someone who had learned early that the cruelest things were always spoken just loudly enough to be heard. But Carl had loved her hair. She stopped herself from thinking it. The thought arrived anyway, the way all unbidden things do, sudden, sharp, with a specific quality of pain that was less like a wound and more like pressure, the kind that doesn't bleed but doesn't stop aching either. She kept walking. Behind her, she heard the murmur of the assembled court. They had come to watch, because courts always came to watch. There was something in the architecture of power that demanded an audience for its cruelties, as though the punishment were only real if enough people witnessed it. Lords and ladies stood in careful clusters, some with their eyes cast down, some watching with the flat, expressionless faces of people who had already decided that what was happening was necessary and therefore none of their concern. A few, very few, looked at her with something that might have been sorrow, or might have been guilt. None of them spoke. The sentence had been delivered that morning in the throne room, with all the cold ceremony that the Alpha King of Atarius could summon. Carl Atarius had stood at the top of the dais, broad and immovable as the mountain behind the castle, his black hair pulled back from his face, his dark eyes holding a quality she had never seen in them before. Not anger, exactly, though anger was there too, burning beneath the surface like coals. But something colder, something closed. The look of a man who had made a decision and was determined not to feel it. He had not looked at her. That had been the worst of it. Not the accusation, which had fallen over the assembled court like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and whispered disbelief through the gathered nobility. Not the word itself, treason, which had sounded so enormous and so wrong in connection with her name that it had taken Amelia several seconds to understand that it was being applied to her. Not even the sentence, which had come quickly, efficiently, with the practiced precision of a king who had learned to separate judgment from feeling. It had been the fact that he would not look at her. She had stood in the center of that vast room, in her red dress, with her white hair and her clasped hands and her pounding heart, and she had looked at him. She had looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly, openly, the way she had looked at him from their very first meeting, when he had walked into the stables and found her standing knee-deep in fresh hay, feeding dried berries to a lame falcon from the flat of her palm, and he had stopped in the doorway and simply watched her for a long moment before either of them spoke. She had looked at him the way a person looks at someone they have decided to trust completely, with all the vulnerability that implies, with all the terrifying openness of a heart that has chosen not to protect itself. He had kept his eyes on the middle distance. She had wanted to say, "Look at me. Please, look at me and tell me you believe this. Look me in the face and say these words." She had said nothing. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube. Extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story, because she had understood in that terrible moment that it would not matter, that whatever had been placed before him, whatever evidence, whatever testimony, whatever carefully constructed lie, had been convincing enough to close something in him, to lock a door that had once stood open, and that no words she could offer, no protestation of innocence, no recounting of her love and her loyalty would find its way through that locked door. Not today. Not with the court watching. Not with whatever poison had been dripped into his ear still working its way through his blood. So she had stood in silence while they read the terms of her exile. And then she had walked out. She was nearly at the outer gates now, the great iron doors that marked the true boundary between the castle and the world beyond, when she heard it. A sound, not the murmur of the court, not the scuff of her own footsteps against the cobblestones, not the distant sound of the wind finding its way between the towers. Something else, something vast and resonant, somewhere between a cry and a roar, a sound that seemed to come from the sky itself, from the place where the air was thin and cold and the eagles flew, from the high currents where great wings could open wide enough to catch the full weight of the wind. Zimbros. She looked up. He came from the east tower, from the high roost where he had slept every night for the past 7 years, curled among golden feathers with his enormous head tucked beneath one wing, dreaming whatever Griffin's dream. He came as he always came when he had truly decided to move, not drifting, not circling, but direct, purposeful, like an arrow loosed from a bow with absolute conviction. His wingspan blocked the pale morning sun for a moment as he descended, and the shadow he cast fell across the entire courtyard, across the assembled court, across the cobblestones still wet with the night's dew, and across the red dress and white hair of the woman walking toward the gates. He landed beside her with a sound like thunder. The ground shook. Not dramatically, not enough to knock anyone from their feet, but enough to feel. A deep, bone-level vibration that traveled up through the soles of everyone's shoes and into their legs and settled somewhere in the chest, like a heartbeat felt from the outside. His talons carved into the stone of the courtyard as though the stone were soft clay, and he folded his enormous wings with the unhurried authority of a creature that had never needed to hurry. And he turned his great golden head toward Amelia and regarded her with those amber eyes. Those terrible, luminous, ancient eyes. And something in his expression, if a griffin can be said to have expressions, shifted into something that looked very much like recognition. Like grief. Like decision. Amelia's hand went to his beak before she had consciously decided to move it. Her fingers traced the familiar line of it, the warm, impossibly smooth surface of his golden plumage, and he pressed into the touch with the whole weight of his enormous head, a gesture so tender it seemed almost wrong coming from a creature of such power. She heard several of the watching nobles draw sharp breaths. Then the king's voice cut across the courtyard. Zimbros. It was the voice Carl used when he was being obeyed before he finished speaking. The voice that commanded armies, that ended arguments, that had never, not once in the history of the Atarius line, been refused. It was not a loud voice. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of generations, the accumulated authority of a bloodline that had ruled this kingdom for 200 years, and it landed in the air with the finality of iron. Stay. That is an order from your king. Zimbros did not move. A silence fell over the courtyard so complete that Amelia could hear her own breathing, slow and deliberate, and the faint sound of the wind in the banners above, and somewhere distant, the calling of a crow. Zimbros did not move. The king descended 2 steps from the dais. His expression had changed. The careful blankness was gone, replaced by something rawer, something that moved beneath the surface of his face like a current beneath still water. His dark eyes were on the Griffin. His hands, she noticed, had closed into fists at his sides. Zimbros. His voice came harder this time. Return to your roost, now. The Griffin turned his great head toward the king, and then he turned it back toward Amelia. And he took 1 step, one single, deliberate, unhurried step, in the direction of the gates. Someone in the assembled court made a sound that was not quite a word. A lord near the back of the group took an involuntary step backward. A young lady in waiting pressed her hands over her mouth. The captain of the guard, a grizzled man who had been in service to the crown for 30 years and had seen things that would make lesser men weep, turned to his second in command with an expression of pure, unvarnished bewilderment. Because the royal Griffin of Atarius had never disobeyed a direct order from his king. In 200 years of recorded history, in all the chronicles and annals and court records that lined the walls of the castle library, in all the stories passed down from lord to lord and keeper to keeper, there was not a single instance of a royal Griffin refusing the command of the crowned ruler of the line. It was not rebellion. It was not defiance in the petty human sense. It was something else entirely. Something that, when the historians would eventually write about this morning, they would struggle to name with precision, settling finally on the word they had used to describe such moments for as long as anyone could remember. Judgment. The Griffin walked behind Amelia as she moved through the outer gates. She did not stop. She did not look back at the king, though every part of her wanted to, though her body seemed to pull backward with a gravity that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with love. That particular, terrible, persistent gravity of a heart that still wanted what it could no longer have. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her feet moving. 1 step, and then another, and then another. And beside her, with his great golden wings half furled and his amber eyes scanning the road ahead, Zimbros walked. The last thing she heard as the gates swung closed behind her was not the king's voice. It was the sound of those iron doors meeting with a finality that seemed to resonate far longer than any door should, as though the sound were still traveling outward, still finding walls to bounce from, still echoing across the morning in the way that the worst endings always do. Long after the moment itself has passed, long after you've stopped listening, somewhere in the distance of a world that has already moved on, the forest received her without ceremony. It had no politics, no expectations, no carefully arranged seating order at the table of consequences. The ancient oaks that bordered the eastern road closed around her, and Zimbros with the simple indifference of things that have been here longer than kingdoms, and expect to be here longer still. Their branches overhead formed a canopy so dense that the pale morning light filtered down in fragments, broken, scattered, beautiful in that particular way that broken things sometimes are, finding patterns in the fragments that were never part of the original whole. Amelia walked until she could no longer hear the sounds of the castle. Then she stopped and pressed her back against the broad trunk of a cedar tree. And finally, with no court to watch her, no judgment to absorb, no dignity to perform, she let herself feel it. It came in waves. Not weeping, not at first. Something before weeping, something larger. a shaking in the chest like the aftershock of something structural giving way, like a building that has been standing on compromised foundations, finally admitting to gravity what it has owed all along. She pressed her fists against her sternum as though she could hold it together by force. Her breath came ragged and thin, and the red of her dress seemed suddenly too vivid, too much, too bright against the muted greens and browns of the forest. And she thought, I should not be wearing this color. I should not be wearing the color of something that is still burning. Zimbros sat beside her. He lowered his enormous body until he was resting on his haunches in the leaf litter, his great weight settling with a slow solidity that communicated something beyond mere physical presence. He curved his neck until his head was beside hers, his golden feathers warm and impossibly soft against her cheek, and he made a sound deep in his chest, not the roar of moments before, not anything loud or dramatic, but a low, continuous sound, barely audible, that vibrated at a frequency she felt more than heard. The sound a creature makes when it is simply present, when it has decided that the most important thing it can do is stay. She buried her face in his feathers and wept. She wept for all the things she had not been able to say in that throne room, for the words that had piled up behind her teeth while she stood in silence and watched the man she loved refuse to meet her eyes, for the months they had spent together, real months, real mornings and evenings and long, unhurried hours, talking in the rose garden while the kingdom went on around them, or sitting in companionable quiet in the library while the candles burned low, or standing together at the high tower window watching Zimbros ride the thermal currents above the city. For the particular quality of those moments, which had felt not like the performance of courtship, but like the simple, private truth of two people becoming necessary to each other. For all of it, for the loss of it, for the violence of how quickly it had ended, for the way love, when it is cut suddenly short, leaves behind a negative space shaped exactly like what was there before. She wept until the waves passed, and then she dried her face on the back of her hand, because there was nothing else to use, and she looked at the forest around her, and she said to Zimbros, very quietly, "What do we do now?" The Griffin regarded her with those amber eyes. He did not answer, of course. He did not need to. She had been talking to him since she was 17 years old, when the old keeper of the royal menagerie had first placed her, nervous and wide-eyed, in the entrance to Zimbros's enclosure, and told her not to make any sudden movements. She had not taken that advice. She had walked straight toward him, and Zimbros had watched her come. And when she was close enough to touch, she had extended her hand palm up, the way she always extended her hand to animals she was meeting for the first time. And Zimbros had lowered his beak to her palm, and sniffed once, twice, and then had butted his great head against her shoulder with a force that knocked her back 2 steps. The keeper had said he'd never seen anything like it. She had come back every day after that. She looked at the forest, and she thought, a place to sleep, water, food, eventually. The immediate mechanics of survival were not complicated. She was not a woman who had spent her entire life in comfortable rooms. She had spent as much time outdoors as in, had accompanied the royal hunting parties not to hunt but to observe, had learned the names of plants and their properties, had listened to the gamekeepers and the foresters and the farmers who came to petition the court, had stored away all of it in the quiet, capacious memory that served her better than it ever served anyone who made a display of their intelligence. She would survive. That was not the question. The question was something harder, something that lived beneath the mechanics of daily existence. The question of what you do with yourself when the life you are building has been taken from you. When the identity you had settled into, queen-to-be, loved woman, keeper of a griffin, steward of a kingdom she had genuinely loved, is stripped away, and you are left with only yourself, raw and uncontextualized, standing in a forest with no audience, and no narrative, and no clear sense of what comes next. She straightened her spine the way she had straightened it while walking through those gates. She was Amelia Brokenwind. She had arrived in this kingdom at 16, with a single bag of belongings, and a name that the court had found amusing for approximately 1 week before it became simply her name. She had not come from power. She had not come from wealth. She had come from a small village 300 miles north, the daughter of a healer, with her mother's knowledge of plants in her hands, and her father's stubbornness in her bones, and a quality that had no precise name, a quality that the people she encountered tended to describe, after the fact, as an ability to be fully present in any situation, to look at whatever was in front of her with complete attention, without the protective filters of assumption or self-interest. She had come to the court of Atarius as a lady's companion to the Earl of Valen's niece. She had stayed because Carl Atarius had walked into the stables. She closed her eyes briefly, and let that memory sit at the back of her mind without engaging it, the way she had learned to sit with difficult things, acknowledging their weight without letting them pull her off her feet. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the forest. "All right," she said to Zimbros. "Let's find a stream." The weeks that followed had a quality she had not expected. They were, in their stripped-down, uncomplicated way, occasionally beautiful. Not in any way that erased the grief, which was still there every morning when she woke. A specific heaviness that occupied the center of her chest, like a stone she had learned to carry. Not in any way that made things easy, because nothing about rebuilding a life from nothing was easy. And the first 2 weeks in particular had been harder than anything she had experienced. But beauty, she had learned a long time ago, did not require the absence of difficulty. It required only the presence of attention. She found a stream within the first hour, following Zimbros, who moved through the forest with the absolute confidence of a creature that navigated by senses she did not have access to. She drank and washed her face, and found the stream circled back to a shallow pool where the water was still enough to reflect the canopy above, and sat for a long time beside it, watching the light change on the surface. She found the cabin 3 days later. It was not much. 4 walls, a roof that had developed a considered relationship with the rain, a fireplace that worked if you were patient with it, and a single window that faced east toward the morning light. It had been empty long enough for the forest to have begun a polite annexation of the corners, moss along the foundations, a small tree growing with cheerful purposefulness through a gap in the back wall. There was a well nearby that still gave clean water. There were signs that someone had kept a garden once, the shapes of former beds still visible under the encroaching grass. She moved in. Zimbros took up residence on the roof, which he shared with a colony of swallows, who seemed to accept his presence with a philosophical adaptability that she found admirable. He hunted in the early mornings. She would hear him leave before dawn, the powerful displacement of air as he launched from the roof, and then quiet, and then sometimes the distant sound of something large moving through the upper forest, and he would return with food she could use, depositing it at her door with the careful satisfaction of a creature meeting what it understood to be its obligations. She rebuilt the garden. She repaired the roof, with considerable effort and several conversations with Zimbros about the theoretical versus practical applications of structural support. She found the wild herbs she knew, and planted them in rows along the south-facing wall. She traded with a village 2 miles east, Zimbros staying back among the trees, because a royal griffin appearing in a village square was the kind of development that required management. Trading dried herbs and her knowledge of remedies for flour and salt, and occasionally a piece of cloth. The villagers did not know who she was, or perhaps they did, and simply chose not to speak of it. She was a woman in a red dress, living in the old gamekeeper's cabin, with an enormous golden creature that periodically flew overhead in patterns that seemed to those watching from below to have a quality of surveillance about them. She helped when she could. A child with a fever, an old man's infected hand, a woman who needed help that none of the other women in the village seemed to know how to offer. She took nothing she hadn't earned, gave more than was expected, and made no claims on anyone's attention. It was a quiet life, quieter than anything she had known. In the evenings, she would sit outside the cabin with her back against the doorframe, and Zimbros beside her, his golden bulk warm and solid against the cooling air, and she would watch the sky darken and the stars appear one by one. And she would think. She thought about the kingdom and the people in it she had cared about. Not the court, not the lords and ladies with their fans and their whispers, but the ordinary people she had spent time among, the grooms and the kitchen staff and the guards who had told her their children's names, the farmers who had come to petition the king and had been surprised to find the future queen asking them questions and listening to the answers. She wondered how they were. She thought about the accusations, turned them over in her mind with the methodical thoroughness she applied to all difficult problems, tried to understand the shape of the lie that had been constructed, who had constructed it, what they had wanted and what they had gained. She had her suspicions. She had had them from the beginning, standing in that throne room, turning quickly through the catalogue of everyone who had reason to want her gone. She thought about Carl. She tried not to. She failed consistently. He arrived in her thoughts the way he had arrived in everything, taking up more space than expected, leaving a quality of presence behind him even when he was absent. She thought about the man she had known, not the king on the dais with his closed eyes and his iron voice, but the other one, the one who appeared only in specific contexts, in the quiet margins of the public performance of being Carletarius, Alpha King, because there had been two of them. She had always known this, even in the early months of their courtship, even before she had fully understood what she was seeing. There was the king, vast, immovable, frightening in the way that mountains are frightening, not through malice, but through sheer scale. The man who walked into rooms and changed their atmosphere, who sat in judgment with a stillness that made hardened warriors uncomfortable, who commanded with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and expected a standard of excellence from everyone around him that he applied, without exception, to himself. And then there was the other one, the one who appeared on slow mornings in the stables when the work was done, and the horses were fed, and there was nothing pressing requiring attention, who sat on an overturned bucket while she cleaned Zimbros's flight feathers and asked her questions about her childhood that no one else had ever thought to ask, who had once spent 2 hours helping her figure out why one of the younger horses was refusing food, not because it was his job, it very much wasn't, but because she was worried and he couldn't seem to make himself leave, who laughed differently when they were alone, not the rare, carefully public laugh of a king making a social calculation, but something looser, something surprised, something that came out of him, as though it had escaped rather than been released. That one she missed until her bones ached. She did not permit herself to wish for him. She was practical enough to understand the geometry of what had happened, that whatever trust had existed between them had been broken, and that trust, once broken, could not be restored by wanting it. She understood also, with the calm that comes from having had time to think without the turbulence of proximity, that his failure had not been a failure of character so much as a failure of faith. He had not believed. When confronted with an accusation that contradicted everything he thought he knew about her, he had not had enough faith in his own knowledge to refuse it. She understood it. She did not excuse it. She thought sometimes about whether she was angry. She examined the question carefully, with the same attention she applied to everything, and found something more complicated than anger. A profound sadness, certainly. A specific grief for the version of the future she had been allowing herself to imagine. The kingdom they would have tended together, the evenings in the library, the long talks about governance and justice and the mechanics of care. A sense of waste, as much as anything, all that potential, all that accumulated understanding between two people, simply discarded. But anger, pure and straightforward? She looked for it, and found something softer underneath. Something that was perhaps the residue of love, which has a persistent quality, which does not simply become its opposite when wounded. Love leaves behind a kind of tenderness, even when the thing that caused it is no longer present. She was tender in her feeling toward him the way a bruise is tender. The pressure of it was painful, but the pain itself was evidence of something that had once been alive. She told herself this was foolishness. She told herself, on most evenings, that it was time to stop thinking about him. She rarely succeeded. In the castle of Atarius, The seasons change the way they always do in kingdoms that have stood long enough to have seen the full range of what time does to certainty. Karl Atarius stood at the window of the high tower, the same tower where Zimbros had once roosted, now conspicuously empty, the roost untouched and unused, and watched the first snow of winter settle on the city below. It fell with the unhurried generosity of early winter, the kind of snow that is still a novelty, before it becomes a burden, and it softened the sharp edges of the rooftops and the streets, and the market stalls in the lower city until everything looked slightly kinder than it actually was. He was not in a kind mood. The month since the exile had been distinguished by a flatness that he had not, initially, recognized as grief. He had been too busy with the mechanics of governance, the petitions, the border disputes, the trade negotiations, the 1,000 daily matters that required his attention and his decisions, to identify what was happening beneath the surface of that activity. He had kept moving because a king in motion is harder to examine than a king at rest. And some part of him had understood, without quite admitting it, that examination was the one thing he was not ready for. Phalith had made herself useful. She was intelligent. He had always known this. She had been at court long enough to understand its rhythms, to know which conversations mattered and which were performance, to read the political currents that ran beneath the formal proceedings with a fluency that he had found in those early months genuinely helpful. She was present in ways that seemed designed to fill exactly the shape of absence Amelia had left behind, appearing with information he needed, with assessments that proved accurate, with a kind of steady, low-pressure companionship that asked nothing of him and offered a great deal. He had allowed it. He had allowed it because he was tired of grief that he could not name, and because Phalith was easy in the way that requiring nothing of someone is always easy, and because he had told himself, with the stubborn confidence of a man who trusted his own judgment above everything, who had built his entire identity on the bedrock of that trust, that he had made the right decision, that the evidence had been clear. That sentiment was a weakness he could not afford. But there were cracks. He noticed them the way you notice cracks in stone. Not all at once, not in a single moment of revelation, but gradually, over time, in the accumulation of small details that individually mean nothing, but together form a pattern. He noticed that Phalith's eyes were quick in the way of people who are always calculating, and that the calculation rarely included other people's welfare. He noticed the way she spoke about the servants, not with cruelty, exactly, but with a kind of practiced disregard that he found, when he paid attention, deeply telling. He noticed that she never asked him questions about himself that weren't useful to her in some way. He noticed that when he mentioned Zimbros, which he did more than he intended, unable to stop, unable to quite close the chapter, something moved across her face that was not quite grief and not quite indifference, but something closer to satisfaction. He had noticed. He had told himself he was being ungrateful, projecting, letting old feeling color his perception. Then the witnesses began to contradict themselves. It had started with a man named Thomas, a minor courier who had given testimony at the original trial. Testimony about messages he claimed to have carried, specific routes and timings, the kind of precise detail that had seemed at the time like evidence of genuine recollection. Karl had not been looking for discrepancies. He had encountered them by accident, in conversation with the captain of the courier corps about something entirely unrelated, and the captain had mentioned Thomas with a slight puzzlement. Something about routes that didn't match, a timing that placed Thomas in a different city than he'd claimed. Karl had summoned Thomas. He had asked questions. Not accusatory ones. Not at first. He was good at questions, had a patience for interrogation that most people found unnerving, a willingness to sit in silence until the space filled itself. And Thomas had filled the silence, increasingly, with the particular kind of detail that told him everything, the detail of a man trying to remember a lie. He had gone home that evening and sat for a very long time in the library. He had not slept. He had pulled the original evidence back out the following morning and gone through it with the same cold, methodical attention he applied to everything. He had looked at it not as the king who had made a judgment he needed to defend, but as the investigator he had, in better times, always tried to be. He had looked at the messages and thought about who had access to the paper, the seal, the roots. He had looked at the testimony and thought about who had the relationships, the influence, the motive to orchestrate such a thing. He had thought about who had benefited. The answer had arrived over the course of several days, with the terrible clarity of something he had known all along, but had refused to look at directly. Faelith. He had not confronted her immediately. He had gathered more evidence first, had sent the captain of the guard to quietly interview other witnesses, had traced the provenance of the documents, had spoken to 2 members of the court who had been present the night of the supposed meeting between Amelia and her alleged co-conspirators, and who had, when presented with the question directly, provided accounts that did not match what they had originally said. The picture that assembled itself was meticulous, intricate, and damning, and it was entirely his own fault, not the conspiracy. That was Faelith's work, and he would deal with Faelith in the way that duplicity of that magnitude deserved to be dealt with. But the exile was his. He had made that choice. He had stood in the throne room with all the authority of his crown, and his bloodline, and his certainty, and he had looked past the woman who loved him with the steadiness of someone who has never once given him a reason to doubt her, and he had chosen the lie. He had chosen it because it had been presented to him at the worst possible moment. At a point when his feelings for Amelia had grown to a size that frightened him, when the vulnerability of loving someone had become so acute that some part of him had welcomed the accusation as a relief, as a way out, because the alternative, standing unguarded before another person and allowing them to matter that much, had felt, to the part of him that was not a king but simply a man with as many fears as anyone else, unbearably dangerous. He understood this about himself now. He had had months of it, months of sitting with his own nature, and it had not been a comfortable process. He thought about Zimbros. He thought about Zimbros often. The empty roost was a constant, daily reminder of everything he had gotten wrong. The Griffin's choice had been so clear, so unambiguous, so ancient in its meaning, that there was no interpretation available that made Carl look right. The legend was not obscure. Everyone in the kingdom knew it. Every child who had ever been told the story of the royal griffin understood what it meant when a griffin chose to follow. He had watched it happen, and told himself that animals were not reliable guides to human affairs, that sentiment was not evidence, that he was a king and not a supplicant to the opinions of his own heraldic beast. He had been, he understood now, spectacularly, wretchedly wrong. He went to the stablemaster and asked for his fastest horse. The stablemaster looked at him for a long moment, then looked at the empty tower, and then nodded once and said nothing, which was the most diplomatic thing Carl had encountered in some time. He rode east. The forest in winter had a quality of enforced honesty. Everything stripped down, all the decorative excess of summer and autumn gone, leaving only the essential shapes. The dark lines of bare branches against the pale sky, the clean geometry of the hills, the occasional evergreen standing dense and dark among its leafless neighbors like a conviction that refused to change. Carl rode through it for 3 days, which was longer than it should have taken, because he had no precise location to aim for, only a general direction and the information that she had been seen near the village of Aldermere by a traveling merchant who had described, with considerable excitement, the golden creature that had been visible above the trees in that area. On the 3rd day, in the late afternoon, with the light going golden and horizontal through the bare branches, he saw something moving above the tree line. A shape, vast and unmistakable. He followed it. The cabin appeared between the trees in the way cabins in winter forests appear. Gradually, through the lessening of trees, the sight of a roof, and then walls, and then a window with light in it, warm yellow light, the kind that means someone is inside and has a fire going. There was a garden along the south wall, visible even under the thin covering of snow, neat rows, herbs mostly, laid out with the methodical care of someone who intended to be there for a while. A woodpile by the east wall, recently stacked. A well with a rope coiled tidily at its base. Zimbros was sitting on the roof. He saw Carl approaching through the trees and straightened, watching with those amber eyes that had never, in all their years together, been difficult to read. They were not warm now. They were not cold either. They were assessing, in the way of a creature that has decided to let events unfold without interference, who has placed himself in the position of witness rather than actor, who will wait and see what a man does with the weight he has been given before making any further decisions. Carl dismounted. He stood in the snow outside the cabin and looked at Zimbros, and Zimbros looked back, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Carl inclined his head. Not a bow, not quite, but something in that register, something that acknowledged a debt he was not sure he could repay. And Zimbros folded his wings and settled back onto the roof and looked at the forest with the magnificent indifference of something that has decided its point has been made. Carl knocked on the door. A pause. The sound of movement inside, then silence. And he understood she had heard the knock and was deciding. And he stood in the cold and waited, hands at his sides, because he had ridden 3 days through a winter forest, and he could wait. The door opened. Amelia stood in the doorway in a dress the color of winter sky, her white hair braided over one shoulder, her eyes, those direct, open eyes that had always looked at him as though they were interested in what was actually there, rather than what was supposed to be there, steady and unreadable. She held a pottery cup in both hands. The light from behind her made a halo of the loose strands of her hair. She did not look surprised. He would think about that later, would come back to it in the long internal accounting of that winter, the fact that she did not look surprised. Had she expected him eventually? Had Zimbros told her, in whatever language existed between a woman and a griffin that had chosen each other in a stable 7 years ago, that he was coming? Or was it simply that she was someone who had, in the months since her exile, done the work of preparing herself for all possible futures, including this one? He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "May I come in?" A pause. Then, stepping back from the door, she said, "Yes." The cabin was small and warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the particular clean scent of a space that is lived in with care. There was a table by the window with a candle on it, and a chair pulled close to the fire, and books. She had accumulated books somehow, which did not surprise him, and a collection of small stones arranged on the windowsill with the deliberateness of someone who finds comfort in small orderings. There was a cot along the far wall with a quilt on it, and beside the fire a cushion that had clearly been appropriated for Zimbros, judging by the considerable displacement of its stuffing. She sat in the chair by the fire. She did not offer him the other chair. It was by the table, too far away. And she did not invite him to sit. And he understood this as not hostility, but accuracy. She did not know yet what this visit was, and she was not going to make it comfortable until she did. He stood near the door, which felt right. He was not entitled to comfort here. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the fire crackled between them, and the silence had the quality of a space that has been carefully prepared, the way she prepared everything, with patience and precision and the refusal to rush. He said, "I know." She did not ask what he knew. She simply looked at him and waited. "I know it was Failith. I know about the forged messages and the arranged witnesses. I know about Thomas and the couriers and the meeting that was staged. I have spent 2 months undoing what she constructed, and I know all of it." Something moved in her face. Not surprise, he noticed again, but something, a tightening, a release, a quality of tension leaving the way. Tension leaves when a thing you have long known is finally spoken aloud by someone who did not know it before. "I have removed her from the court. I have removed her, and I have ensured that her removal is permanent." She nodded, very slightly. Not gratitude, not relief, acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of someone receiving information that was her due. He kept his eyes on her face. He had ridden 3 days for this moment, and he was going to look at her the way he had failed to look at her in that throne room. Directly, completely, with no protected distance between his face and the truth of what he was seeing. "Amelia," he said. And then, with the deliberate and irreversible quality of a man who has decided that the only path forward requires going to his knees, he went to his knees. Not a courtesy bow, not the measured lowering of a head that acknowledges rank while preserving ego. Both knees, on the wooden floor of a cabin in a winter forest, the Alpha King of Atarius, in his riding clothes still marked by 3 days of travel, looking up at the woman he had exiled in red and silence and the unbearable correctness of her uprightness. The fire threw his shadow long against the wall behind him. "I failed you in every way a person can fail someone they love. Not only in the throne room, though that was sufficient. I failed you in the months before. In every moment when I let my own fear make decisions that I should have let my heart make. I failed you when I chose the evidence of paper over the evidence of everything I knew about you. I failed you when I could not trust myself enough to trust what we had built together. I failed you in the way that I am most capable of failing, by confusing certainty with strength, and finding it easier to believe a lie than to accept my own vulnerability." He paused. Amelia had not moved. She sat in the chair with her hands around the pottery cup and her eyes on his face, and she was so still that the only thing that moved in the entire cabin was the fire. "I am not here to ask you to return. I am not here to tell you that you belong in the castle, or that your place is beside me on a throne, or to make any claim on your future whatsoever. You owe me nothing. You have never owed me anything. What you gave me, you gave freely, and I treated it with a carelessness that I will carry with me for the rest of my life." He looked at her. "I am here because I needed you to know that I know, that someone spoke the truth of what happened, even if it was only to you, in a cabin in a winter forest, with no court to witness it. You were wronged. You were wronged by me. That is the truth, and I needed to say it to your face." He waited. The fire crackled. Outside, faintly, he heard Zimbros shift on the roof. That familiar sound, the settling of a vast weight, the adjustment of something immense finding its equilibrium. Amelia set the pottery cup on the arm of the chair. She looked at him for a long time. He had always thought he knew her expressions well, had believed himself a careful reader of her, and now he realized he had been reading the version of her that existed in relation to him, the version that was conscious of his presence, that had its own complicated adjustments happening beneath the surface. He was seeing something else now, the version that had spent months alone with only a griffin and a forest, and the unsparing company of her own thoughts. It was the same face, but there was something in it that had not been there before, a quality of settled depth, like a river that has found a new channel and is no longer turbulent. She said, "Do you know what I thought about, those first nights in the forest?" He said nothing. He waited. "I thought about how I should have seen it coming. Not Phalith, specifically, but something. I thought about how I had let myself become so absorbed in what was building between us that I had forgotten to pay attention to the landscape around it. I was not careful. I was careless in my happiness." She looked at the fire briefly, then back at him. "And then I realized that was wrong. That is the trap. That when someone uses your love against you, the natural response is to blame the love for existing, to decide that the vulnerability was the problem, to build walls." She paused. "I decided not to do that." He felt something move in his chest. "What hurt most," she said, "was not the exile. The exile I could survive. You can see that. A gesture, encompassing the cabin, the garden beyond the window, the entire small life she had built. What hurt most was the moment when I realized that you looked at me and made a choice about what you were willing to believe, and the choice you made had very little to do with me. It had to do with something inside yourself. Something that was afraid. The word landed in the silence between them with absolute precision. Carl, on his knees, made no move to defend himself. He recognized what she was saying with the specific pain of recognition. The way truth that has been circling you for months arrives, when someone else names it, with a force that is almost physical. "Yes," he said. Amelia looked at him. "You were afraid. And because you were afraid, you did not trust me. And because you did not trust me, you were willing to believe the worst of me on the strength of evidence that, if you had been thinking clearly, you would have torn apart in an afternoon." She said it without anger. The observation was purely factual. "That is what I needed you to understand. Not as punishment, as truth." "Yes," he said again. A pause. "I also need you to understand." And her voice changed slightly, deepened. "That I know who you are. The real answer of who you are, not the official version. I have seen you in the stable at dawn talking to the horses before any of the grooms arrived, because you could not sleep and did not know what else to do with yourself. I have sat with you in the library at 2 a.m. while you reread the same paragraph 6 times because you were angry about a decision you had made and too proud to say so. I have watched you with the farmers who came to petition you. Watched the real attention you gave them. The real weight you put behind their concerns. The care that never made it into any official record but was always there." She met his eyes. "I know that you are capable of great tenderness. And I know that you only showed it in the dark, in the private places, in the margins of being the king. Because the tenderness frightened you. Because something in your life had taught you that softness was a liability." He had not known he was holding his breath until it left him. "I am telling you this. Not to console you. I am telling you because you need to hear it from someone who has actually looked. Who looked without wanting anything from you, at the beginning, without a stake in what she found. I looked, and what I found was someone worth loving. That is not diminished by what happened. It is part of the same thing." The fire had burned lower. The candle on the table had burned almost to its base. Outside, the winter dark had come fully in while they were talking, and the window was black with it. And somewhere in the darkness, Zimbros was a warm gold shape on the roof, patient as the night. Carl said, "I do not deserve forgiveness." "No," she agreed. "You don't. Not in any accounting that adds up cleanly." She paused. "Forgiveness is not about what someone deserves. It is about what I choose to carry forward, and what I choose to put down." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I have been carrying this for 6 months. The anger I didn't let myself feel in the beginning. The grief. The specific, particular loneliness of having been seen and then unseen by the one person who mattered most." Her voice remained steady, but it cost her something. He could see it, that specific quality of effort that is different from composure. "I have carried all of it, and I have thought about it more carefully than I have thought about almost anything in my life." She looked at him. "And I think," she said carefully, "that to carry it forward, to keep carrying it as a weight between us, would be to let Phalith win something she has not earned. It would be to take the damage she intended and maintain it myself, voluntarily, beyond the point where it is useful." She stood up. She was not tall, had never been tall, but she had a quality of presence that had nothing to do with height, a quality he had noticed in the stables 7 years ago and had never been able to adequately explain. She stood and looked down at him where he knelt on the wooden floor of the cabin, and she held out her hand. It was not a gesture of permission. It was not a restoration of the old order. It was something new, a threshold, an offer, a willingness to begin something that had no guarantee and no map, only the choice to move toward rather than away. He looked at her hand. He thought about the last time he had reached for something with no certainty of being met. He thought about what it had cost him the last time he had let something matter enough to be afraid of. He thought about Zimbros walking behind her through the gates, about the absolute clarity of that choice, the unsentimental accuracy of a creature that felt truth directly and acted on what it felt. He reached up and took her hand. He rose to his feet, and for a moment they simply stood in the small, warm cabin in the winter forest, holding on to each other with the tentative firmness of people who have been through something terrible together and are discovering, with some surprise, that they are still standing. She said, very quietly, "I am not the same person I was." "No. Neither am I." "Good," she said. Outside, Zimbros made that sound again, that deep, resonant, barely audible vibration that she had felt more than heard on the first night in the forest. The sound of simple presence, the sound of something that has decided to stay. They did not return to the castle immediately. There was something right about that. Something that acknowledged the scale of what had happened and what was being chosen. That these things could not simply be reversed with a ride back through the forest and a resumption of where they had left off. The life that had been interrupted could not simply be restarted. It had to be rebuilt, and rebuilding takes time, and time taken honestly has a quality of restoration that acceleration cannot provide. He stayed in the cabin for 2 weeks. He sent a messenger back on the second day, a brief note that contained enough information to satisfy the minimum requirements of his absence, and not a word more. The kingdom would survive 2 weeks without him at its precise center. He had built it well enough for that. What he could not build elsewhere was what was happening here, in this small winter world between the trees, where there was no court and no ceremony and no carefully maintained performance of power. Only 2 people and a griffin, and the unadorned work of finding out whether the thing between them was strong enough to survive the worst that had been done to it. It was not easy. Nothing honest is easy. There were conversations that lasted half the night. Conversations about trust, about fear, about the specific failures of his character that had made him vulnerable to Phaleth's manipulation. He told her things about himself he had told no one, had not even properly told himself, things that required the careful excavation of years of certainty before they could be spoken. About his father, whose strength he had imitated so completely that he had ended up mistaking imitation for the real thing. About the years of governance that had trained him to suspect the motives of everyone who came close to him, until he had stopped being able to distinguish between the genuinely dangerous and the genuinely good. About what it had felt like to find, in a woman in a stable talking to a falcon, someone who seemed to want nothing from him except the thing that was hardest to give, his real self, the undefended one, the one that existed before and after the performance of being the Alpha King. She listened. She asked questions with the precise, interested quality that was entirely hers. She pushed back when he avoided, and allowed silence when he needed it, and was honest in ways that sometimes required him to sit with discomfort rather than explain it away. He listened in return. He learned things about her that he had not known, about the village she came from, the healer mother and the stubborn father, the years of being slightly out of place everywhere she went, until she arrived at the castle and found Zimbros, who apparently experienced no such ambivalence, and had made his position extremely clear from the beginning. He learned what the months of exile had been like, not the practical facts, which were visible in the cabin and the garden and the repaired roof, but the interior weather of it, the waves, the grief, the gradual and determined work of building a self that was not dependent on a context that had been taken away. He admired her profoundly. He told her so. She looked at him steadily and said, "I know," without any false modesty. And he found this so perfectly right that he laughed, and she smiled. And Zimbros lifted his enormous head from the cushion by the fire and regarded them both with the expression of a creature who has been patiently waiting for the humans in his life to arrive at the obvious. The morning they finally rode back toward the castle, the snow had stopped, and the sky was the particular blue that only appears in winter. Clear, cold, infinite, stripped of all warmth and all haziness. The forest around them was still and clean, the kind of still that feels like preparation rather than absence, like the pause before something begins. Amelia rode beside him, not behind, on the chestnut mare that had been borrowed from the village stable and would need to be returned with thanks and a fair price. She rode with the slightly informal ease of someone who learned to ride in fields rather than arenas, and she kept her white hair loose today. It moved in the cold air as they rode, pale as the snow on the branches, and he watched it from the corner of his eye the way he watched everything about her now, with the deliberate attention of a man who has learned the cost of not looking. Zimbros flew above them. He flew the way he always flew when he was in good spirits, not straight, not purposeful, but in great, elaborate spirals that seemed motivated by something that could only be described as joy. The golden light of his wings in the winter sun was visible from a long way off, and they heard, as they approached the first outlying village, the sound of people emerging from their houses to look up at the sky. A child in a doorway pointed and shouted something. An old man in the road stopped and shaded his eyes and watched the Griffin turning his circles above the trees, and then turned to look at the riders approaching from the forest, and his expression went through a series of rapid adjustments that landed finally on something that had no name, but felt like the sensation of a long-held breath being released. By the time they reached the castle gates, a crowd had gathered. Not a formal assembly, not the ceremonial arrangement of a court receiving its king. Something more organic than that. People spilling from the lower city up toward the gates with the unstoppable quality of water finding its level. They lined the road, pressed together in the winter cold, and when Amelia came through the gates, there was a sound, not a cheer, not the organized, obligatory sound that courts produce on command, but something rougher and more real, the sound of people who have been waiting for something without quite knowing what it was they were waiting for, and are now, all at once, certain. She looked at them with the same expression she had always given them. Open, present, fully there, as though each individual face in the crowd were the only face in the crowd. A woman in the front row, someone who had brought petitions to the castle twice in the years before the exile, covered her mouth with both hands. A young guard standing at attention along the route lost his professional composure entirely and simply stared. Carl rode beside her and watched her receive the welcome of the people who had always known what he had taken too long to understand, and the specific quality of grief that he had been carrying since the throne room that morning. The grief of being the one who got it wrong, shifted very slightly in the direction of something more bearable. Not healed, not dissolved, but lightened, as weight is lightened by being shared. The court reassembled in the throne room, and the quality of that assembly was different from every other Carl could remember in the past months. There was a heightened attention, a feeling of collective breath being held, a sense that what was about to happen was going to be either very right or very wrong, and that everyone present knew which it needed to be. Carl stood on the dais. Beside him, not behind, not a step back, but beside, stood Amelia in her red dress, with her white hair loose around her shoulders, with Zimbros seated at the foot of the dais in a posture that defied every protocol about animals in formal settings, and that no one had attempted to alter. Carl looked out at the assembled court. He said, "Amelia Brokenwind was exiled from this kingdom on false evidence, constructed by someone who wished her harm and who used my own failures to accomplish it. The guilt for what was done to her belongs, first and entirely, to me. The acknowledgement of this is not a political act. It is the minimum I owe her." No one moved. I am not asking anyone to forget what happened. I am asking this court to understand what it means when a king gets something as important as this wrong, and what the obligation is when he knows it. The obligation is not to protect himself. It is to correct the record, and to accept the consequences of having been wrong. He looked at Amelia. She looked back at him with the steady, open quality that he had learned, in a cabin in a winter forest, to receive without flinching. "Amelia, will you stay?" The question filled the throne room with a silence so complete it had texture. She let it sit. She was not, he knew now, a woman who rushed her answers. Not out of calculation, but out of the genuine conviction that important things deserved to be considered with full attention before being spoken. He had stopped finding this uncomfortable. He had come to understand it as one of the truest things about her. Then she said, quietly, but without any hesitation, "Yes." Above the throne room, through the high windows, a shadow crossed the winter light. Zimbros, returning to the east tower, returning to the roost. The sound he made as he landed, that deep, resonant, thunder-adjacent impact of enormous weight-finding purchase, moved through the stone walls of the castle and into the feet of everyone standing in the throne room, and something in the quality of that vibration, something in the frequency of it, made 3 ladies in waiting and 2 minor lords quietly begin to weep without quite knowing why. The coronation was planned for spring, but the weeks between that winter return and the first warmth of the new season had their own quality, which was perhaps better than ceremony, the quality of ordinary days. Days that did not need to be significant to matter. Days in which 2 people learned, gradually and with some difficulty and considerable negotiation, how to exist in proximity without armor. He learned to stay in a room when the conversation became uncomfortable rather than finding an urgent matter that required his attention elsewhere. She learned to tell him, directly, when something he did caused her pain rather than absorbing it in silence. That particular silence she had been trained to. The silence of someone who had spent too much time in places where directness was dangerous. He learned to ask for what he needed rather than waiting for her to intuit it, which she was frustratingly good at, but which was, he admitted, an unfair thing to rely on. She learned to let him be present in the quiet spaces without feeling that his presence required management. Zimbros observed all of this from various elevated positions throughout the castle, with the expression of someone attending a theater performance that is going more or less as expected. There were mornings when Carl would wake before the sun and go to the stables the way he used to, not because he needed to be there, but because it was where he had always gone when he needed to think, and he would find her already there. She had been given back the care of the royal menagerie without needing to be asked, and she had resumed her routines with the quiet efficiency of someone who had never stopped knowing how to do the work, only temporarily been prevented from doing it. He would lean on the stall gate and watch her tend to the animals, and she would talk to him while she worked, which was the form their best conversations took. Words that flowed more freely when the hands were occupied, when the eyes had somewhere neutral to rest. She told him about things she had thought in the cabin that she had not told him during his 2 weeks there, observations she had made about the kingdom from the outside, the things visible from a village 2 miles into the forest that were not visible from inside the castle walls. He listened with the attention of someone who has learned that the perspective of someone who sees you clearly is among the most valuable things a king can have, and is also among the rarest. He told her one morning about the fear. He had named it once, in the cabin, briefly, and she had heard it, but he had not fully articulated what it felt like from the inside, the specific quality of it, the way it had operated not as a single dramatic moment of panic, but as a constant low-level current that ran beneath everything, the perpetual monitoring of exposure, the careful management of what was visible, the way that loving her had amplified the fear rather than diminishing it, until it had become unbearable, and the accusation had arrived at exactly the moment when some part of him had been looking for a way to close the door. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "I know. Not I know meaning I already knew, though she did. I know meaning. I see you. I know what this is, and I am still here." He had not known, until that moment, that those 2 words in that sequence could constitute the single most significant thing anyone had ever said to him. The coronation came with the first warm wind of spring. The kingdom turned out in the way kingdoms turn out for events they have decided to care about, completely, with a totality that overrides weather and convenience and whatever the day was supposed to have been. The lower city was decorated in Atarius colors, the gold and deep blue that matched Zimbros's plumage and the winter sky respectively, and flowers that had been coaxed early from the first warmth lined the streets from the castle gates down to the central market. Amelia wore red. She had considered briefly something more formal, the traditional ivory of Atarius brides, or the deep blue of the court's ceremonial wardrobe. She had stood in front of the available options on the morning of the coronation, and made her choice with the same quiet certainty with which she made all her choices, and the seamstress who had brought the options had looked at what she chose, and then looked at her face and had simply nodded. The crown was placed on her head by Carl's own hands. He had insisted on this deviation from protocol with a firmness that had ended the conversation in the first minute, which was the royal prerogative he most unambiguously enjoyed exercising. He stood before her in the throne room, in the full ceremonial regalia of the Alpha King of Atarius, and he placed the crown of Atarius queens on her white hair, and he said, in front of the assembled court and the nobles and the ambassadors from neighboring kingdoms and the representatives of the villages and the farms, the thing that he had never said publicly, because he had always believed, wrongly, that public sentiment was a weakness. I give this not as ceremony and not as obligation. I give it as truth. There is no one in this kingdom, in this world, better suited to wear it. Amelia looked at him steadily. She said, "Then I will wear it well." And then Zimbros, who had been permitted into the throne room for this occasion with such a quality of inevitability that no one had thought to argue against it, opened his enormous golden wings. Not in flight. There was not room for flight in the throne room. He opened them as a statement, as a declaration, the way the sun opens on a clear morning after a long dark, spreading into every corner, filling every shadow, undeniable and complete. The light caught the gold of his feathers and threw it in shards across the walls and the floor and the assembled faces and the crown newly placed on white hair, and he raised his head and made the sound that every person in the room felt in their bones, that deep, resonant, ancient sound that was not quite a roar and not quite a song, but contained elements of both, that was the sound of something enormous and true, affirming itself in the presence of witnesses. The court was silent for a long moment. Then, beginning from the back, from the ordinary people who had been admitted to the edges of the room, the grooms and the kitchen staff, and the farmers' representatives and the village delegates, a sound began. Not the organized, ceremonial acknowledgement of nobility performing its function. Something else. Something that gathered volume as it moved through the room, as it passed from the people in the back, to the minor lords and ladies in the middle, and finally to the senior nobility at the front, who added their voices to it not as performance, but as genuine capitulation to the feeling of the room. It was the sound a kingdom makes when it recognizes itself. Later, weeks later, months later, in the long ordinary seasons that followed the spring coronation, Amelia would stand at the east window of the high tower in the early morning, in the quiet before the castle woke, and watch Zimbros ride the warm currents that rose from the sun-heated stones of the city. He was enormous against the sky, golden, impossibly beautiful, turning his great circles over the kingdom with the unhurried authority of something that belongs precisely where it is. She would think about the morning she walked through the gates. She would think about it not with grief. The grief had not disappeared, but it had transformed. The way things transform when they are processed honestly, becoming part of the fabric of who you are, rather than a weight carried separately. She would think about it as the beginning of something, rather than the end of something. The moment when everything fell apart, so that what remained could be examined clearly. The moment when a griffin made a choice that a king could not yet make, and walked away from the gate into a forest and waited, with the patience of something that has always understood what matters, and has no interest in hurrying the humans along. She would think about what she had become in that forest. The version of herself that existed independent of context, independent of love, independent of any external definition. The version that had rebuilt a roof and a garden and a daily life out of nothing, and had discovered in the process a quality of self-possession that no amount of approval could have given her, because the only way to know what you are capable of is to be left, for a time, to demonstrate it to yourself. She had not been grateful for the exile. She was not going to pretend that it had been a gift. It had been a wound, and wounds are not gifts, and the person who inflicted it had been wrong and should have been wrong, and she had not and would not pretend otherwise. But she had survived it. And in surviving it, she had become someone more fully herself than she had been before. And that person, that Amelia, the one who had walked through a winter forest and built a life in a cabin and learned to receive a king kneeling on a wooden floor with the calm of someone who has already done the work of deciding who she is. That was the woman who stood here now. She heard the door open behind her. Carl. He crossed the room with that particular quality of movement that was his alone, large and deliberate, and not quite quiet, the movement of a man who takes up the space he requires without apology. And he came to stand beside her at the window, and they stood together looking out at the sky where Zimbros was still turning his morning circles, gold against blue, vast and entirely himself. Carl said nothing. She said nothing. They had learned the value of this together, the specific quality of companionship that requires no words to be complete, that is content to share a window and a sky and a Griffin and the early light. After a while he said, "He's been out there for 2 hours. He likes the morning thermals," she said. "He is showing off," he said. She smiled. "Possibly. He has an audience." Carl looked at her profile for a moment. She felt it, the way she had learned to feel his attention, as something warm and particular and specific to her. Then he looked back at the sky. "I have been thinking about what you told me in the forest, about fear." She waited. "I have been thinking that I have spent most of my life treating courage as the absence of fear, as though fear itself were the problem, and the goal were to have none of it." He paused. "I think that is wrong." "Yes," she responded. "I think courage is choosing to act correctly in the presence of the fear, not eliminating it, just not letting it make the decisions." She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at the sky, at the golden shape of Zimbros against the morning blue, and his profile had the quality she had come to associate with his honest self. The line of it less defended than when he was in the public rooms, the jaw not quite set, the eyes not quite guarded, simply looking at what was there. "It took me a long time to understand that." "I know," she said. He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him, openly, completely, the way she had always looked at him from the very beginning, with all the terrifying, necessary, irreducible vulnerability of a person who has decided that what they love is worth the risk of loving it. He reached out and tucked a strand of her white hair back from her face, very gently, with the particular tenderness of someone who has learned, slowly, painfully, through loss and reckoning and the hard work of rebuilding, that gentleness is not the opposite of strength, that the man who commands armies and ends arguments and carries a kingdom in his hands is the same man who can touch a strand of white hair with that quality of care, and that these are not contradictions to be resolved, but a wholeness to be inhabited. Outside, Zimbros turned one final, enormous circle above the castle. Then he opened his wings wide, wider than wide, the full, impossible span of them catching the morning light and throwing it gold across the towers and the rooftops and the streets below, and he let out a single, resonant cry. Not the territorial roar, not the war sound, something older than both of those, something that had no functional purpose and required none. And the sound of it traveled across the kingdom the way the legend always said it did, all the way to the outer edges, all the way to the farms and the villages and the forest roads and the small cabin between the trees, where a garden now grew untended but not forgotten. And then he dropped into a long, gliding descent back toward the east tower, back toward the roost, back toward the place where he had always belonged, the golden Griffin of Atarius, returning to his home. A Griffin never abandons a pure heart. He never had. He never would. And the kingdom, watching from its windows and its market stalls and its morning doorsteps, understood, in the way that people understand the truest things, Not with their minds first, but with the whole of their bodies, in the bones, in the blood. That what had been broken had been made whole again, not the same as before, better than before. Stronger in the broken places, the way things are when they are mended with honesty rather than pretense, with the full acknowledgement of damage and the full commitment to what comes after. Amelia stood at the window with Carl beside her and watched the Griffin settle on the tower. And in the great kingdom of Atarius, the morning continued. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.